but it's definitely you're buying this property for a cash heavy.
But it is
strategy.
guaranteed rented out. Like you were saying, these properties are definitely guaranteed rented out. So if for me, like from my perspective, a strategy where it's purely investment, I'm looking for pure cash flow. It kind of answers all my questions. In regards to the capital gain, that's a different, like, unless I'm looking for capital gain to hold and sell, I guess that's a different strategy as well.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, and it might be different from like a lender's perspective, but from our perspective, when we're looking to build a portfolio, we want a mixed portfolio. We want properties that are going to go up in value. But we also, and we've been discussing this, I think, about every week, almost in terms of servicing. If you buy too many properties that are negative, the bank's going to stop giving you money. You just can't afford to borrow any more money, right? So we do like to mix it. We're looking at properties that are capital growth strong, and then we look at properties such as due occupancies where you can get great cash flow as well to balance the book. And a lot of the times we're looking at these portfolios, our end strategy is to pay off debt on everything and just live off rent a lot of the time. So if you've got a couple $1 million worth of properties, 5.5% yield across all of them, you're looking at $100,000 passive across the portfolio, and that's a lot of people's goals. And so a lot of the time the strategy could be have a couple of these cash cows. We call them cash cows because there's so much cash coming from them. And then these properties that have so much capital growth, you might just sell one of those properties, use that money to pay a debt, and then these cash flow properties, these due occupancies, have a major place towards the end of that. But also it does really help when it comes to serviceability in terms of building that portfolio.
Yeah.
Is there anything that a client needs to be wary of from a lending perspective when they're looking at a due occupancy property?
Not really. We just have to provide. So, example, I'm doing one at the moment. We just have to provide 2 rental appraisals for each property, so each duplex. And as long as, like, for example, when a real estate agent provides us a rental appraisal, it can be between 550 to 600. They're going to use that 550, the minimum one, to be more conservative. When it comes to SMSFs, Mark would know as well in regards to purchasing a due occupancy through the SMSF. It can be done with a limited number of lenders, but with most of them, as Mark can witness, basically, like, they're not going to touch it for some stupid policy reason. What was it, Mark? The policy?
They just considered it to be an unacceptable security. But most were doing it. It was just 1 or 2 that weren't. But they were, like, predominantly they were happy to do it. It was just 1 or 2 that were being weird about it.
Yeah. Because there was 2 dwellings on the one title, they just didn't accept that. There was just too much risk for the appetite for 2 dwellings on the one title.
Yeah.
Mark, which sounds silly because it's more money, but
yeah, me and Mark had this conversation the other day, and I got angry.
Yeah.
Similar. You know what I'm talking about. Mark, are there any lenders that don't like due occupancy properties, like in general? Like, you tell them, we're looking at a due occupancy, and they won't lend?
If it's in the SMSF, like we were saying, there are some that don't do it, and they do deem it as unacceptable securities, even if it has its own mailbox and its own address and all this sort of stuff. Even if it's side by side, doesn't matter. If it's on the same title, they won't do it. But there obviously are solutions that do it. In terms of the normal residential space, if you're purchasing outside of your SMSF, whether it's a trust or your personal name or a company, generally everyone will do it if there's 2 dwellings. But when you start increasing over 3 dwellings, so even 3 dwellings, most lenders do. When you get to 4, 5, and it keeps going up from there, then a lot of lenders don't do it, and you have to go through private lenders. So a lot of like, for example, with the big 4, for example, Westpac, they have Westpac Private Bank, and it deals with specific sort of things like that. And there are other lenders that do the same. So you have to start dealing with more specialized type of lending if there's more than probably 3 dwellings. When you're looking at 4, there are still some that will do it, but a lot of them will say no.
Yeah. Does that start moving into commercial space at that point?
Yeah, and there's a lot of like tests associated with that. Like, I called one the other day, and they have like asset and liquidity tests that they do. It's not like a normal sort of assessment that we would do. So you need to have a minimum amount in assets. You need to have a minimum amount liquid. The rates are slightly different, and the rules in general are different in terms of LVR and LMI and all that sort of stuff. There are differences.
Yeah. I remember we were looking at a block of units for someone a while ago. I think there was 6 units on the one title, and it had to be considered as a commercial property. It wasn't. Yeah.
Oh.
So that's obviously a different ballgame completely.
The main reason why it gets pushed out to that is because, again, when we go back to the risk appetite, when you're purchasing that many properties on, not so much on the one title, it is subdivided, but you're increasing that assessment rate for each of those properties. So if you're building more than 4 or 5, your risk appetite goes up by that, that 5 amount, because you've got 5 properties there. What if something were to go wrong? The bank sees that as worst case scenario every single time. What if something were to go wrong and we want to sell them and they're all exactly the same or pretty much similar, and it doesn't cover the loan amounts? So the reason why it gets pushed out to commercial, like Mark said, there's a lot more they look into to make sure that there's a certain amount of surplus left in their account on a monthly basis. They have a certain amount of assets to fall back onto as worst case scenario. There's a lot more testing and higher assessment rates looked at it.
Yeah, fair enough. Which my mind doesn't make sense because if
I can even guess what you and Mark talked about the other day.
Yeah, you definitely know what we're having to talk about. It gets me angry every time, but that's a topic for another day. Okay, so in terms of lending, it's still pretty straightforward. If it's 1 or 2, or even 3, fairly straightforward. Obviously, from building a portfolio perspective, from our perspective, it's got a place definitely in the portfolio. I think for people like with lower incomes or single incomes, it's not a bad way to start chasing the cash flow. Obviously, buying these properties only with knowing that the capital growth is quite slow or slower than a residential property can slow down your acquisition phase, because you obviously have to save a deposit every time and you can't use equity because it doesn't go up in value. But I think especially when you're first starting or you're towards the end as well, like kind of on both sides, it can really have a good place in terms of building that portfolio for either immediate serviceability to help you with the next, or towards the end of the portfolio to get that cash cow at the end before you pay all the debt down. Do you guys have any questions regarding Duox? I mean, it's pretty straightforward, to be honest. I don't really have any other questions for you guys.
Because to be honest, they're just normal as residential. They're just 2 properties together, 3 properties together. And like Mark mentioned before, the only time it does get a little bit more complicated if we're building more with that 3 or 4. But man, I'm definitely a fan. If you can purchase an investment property with 2 rental incomes coming in and only start growing from there, whether it's for capital growth or not, I mean, that cash flow really gives you a bit of a kick start to your portfolio.
Yeah.
Like a massive push, yeah.
Yeah, cool. Well, I think that's a good short episode. Makes it a bit easier for Mark to edit this.